Afternoon, everyone. Could I invite you to assemble yourselves? I have a feeling there's a few people who are currently trying to log into what they think is a Teams meeting on their calendar and suddenly realising this is just a live event. But so good afternoon, everyone. We at the Centre for Urban Research and the Sustainability and Urban Planning program acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct our research, teaching and service. We respectfully acknowledge ancestors and elders past, present and emerging, who have always been caring for country. We pay our respects to country, the life world that sustains us all. Our research, education and service are already in a relationship with country and the people of country, here and in all the places where we undertake our business. As mostly non-Indigenous people, we acknowledge our obligation in this relationship to uphold the nganga or understanding of Bunjil and practice respect for community and culture. Though there is much we still need to learn, especially about ourselves, we affirm our Dumbali or commitment to that work. We hold as central to our business Dumbali to a shared future with Indigenous peoples everywhere, and especially Kulin country and peoples. In offering the Centre for Urban Research's acknowledgement of country, I also note the contribution that Professor Libby Porter has made in leading scholarship on settler colonial questions and through our Kur on Country project that produced the foregoing acknowledgement. Colleagues, this afternoon we're gathered for a celebration of the Centre for Urban Research, which as of, we think, the month of January 2023 will have been operating for 10 years. Academic groups and collaborations are often temporal efforts, dependent on institutional support or funding, or the ambition and energies of the scholars that sustain them. They do not always last. We think the achievement of the Centre for Urban Research in sustaining a collective of researchers over the past 10 years, with all of the transformations and disruptions that we've witnessed in that period, and the many challenging research questions and problems thrown up by those changes, deserves to be marked in a formal sense. And given the time of year, a celebration is merited. So the format today is a celebration, but one that is contextualised through reflection and deliberation on the work that the Centre has done and the contribution it has made through this symposium format that we're running. We're pleased to share this moment with colleagues from across RMIT University and from our wider set of community stakeholders. Welcome to you all. The Centre for Urban Research was founded in early 2013 with the aim of connecting people and ideas for sustainable cities and regions. The Centre was formed from within the School of Global Urban and Social Studies by bringing researchers from across 4 groups. The RMIT AHURI Centre and its tradition of critical scholarship in housing, led by Professor Emeritus Mike Berry. Colleagues within the Centre for Design, whose work focused on sustainable design and consumption in urban contexts, was led by Professor Ralph Horn. Researchers in the Sustainability and Urban Planning program, in particular those focused on urban planning questions, led by Professor Michael Buxton, and the growing Interdisciplinary Conservation Science group, led by Professor Sarah Beckersey. And although not an original part of Kur, I note the later inclusion of the Healthy Livable Cities group, which joined us in 2017, led by distinguished Professor Billy Giles Kortai. Over the last decade, the Centre has grown to an assembly of around 75 academic staff with around 40 PhD students. The Centre draws in around 5 million in research funding each year. That's about the size of a medium-sized CRC or Centre of Excellence, and produces about 130 academic publications as well as a raft of other contributions, including a very active media presence. And I'd note that both Sarah Beckersey and Andrew Butt were recognised at the university level as media stars in the Media Star Awards released last week. The Centre sits at the core of RMIT's priority area of smart and sustainable cities, and we're central to the Urban Futures Enabling Impact program. My colleague, Professor Emeritus Robin Goodman, and panellists will be offering further reflections on the creation of the Centre and the research questions it has addressed. In mentioning that, I'd like to especially acknowledge the contribution that Robin has made to the Centre for Urban Research in her role as founding director of the Centre and as the Associate Dean for Sustainability and Urban Planning, and subsequently as Dean of our school. Much of the early impetus for the centre came from Robin's initiative and efforts. I'd also like to acknowledge our former Dean, Professor Emeritus David Hayward, who can't be here today, but David's role was instrumental in supporting Kerr within the school in the early days. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Hartmut Funfgeld from the University of Freiburg, who can't be here this afternoon. Unfortunately, it's a bit early in Germany right now, and we didn't trust our logistics to be able to AV him into the room, but Hartmut was the Kerr director at the time of my arrival in 2014. I think he was handed the role by Robin, but he does send his warmest wishes to us all. I'd also like to note the important contributions that colleagues Professor Andrew Butt, Professor Wendy Steele and Associate Professor Joe Hurley have made to the centre at various times through their roles as Associate Dean for the Sustainability and Urban Planning Program, which is obviously the teaching equivalent of Kerr. I'd also recognise Professor Hannah Badland and Associate Professor Ian McShane, who have both served as Deputy Director of Kerr. And I also note the contributions made by Professor Billy Giles Kortai, Professor Lauren Rickards, in their Urban Futures Enabling Capability platform roles, which have obviously been very closely connected to Kerr, especially through the research they've undertaken. And I also recognise and welcome the many colleagues and students who've contributed to Kerr through scholarship, research, engagement and general enthusiasm for that work and for the centre over the past decade, especially the senior staff in the centre who've contributed leadership of our 9 research programs. This afternoon's session is structured in 2 panel sessions. First, we'll take a retrospective look at the centre and how it's been positioned within debates about urban sustainability questions, both within RMIT and within wider academic, disciplinary and public debates. Next, we'll look at the coming decade and beyond to the pressing urban sustainability challenges we face, whether in Melbourne or at the planetary scale, and how Kerr might respond. During the afternoon, we'll also hear from Professor Tom Bentley from RMIT's Strategy, Policy and Impact team. He's up next to reflect on the way the university has addressed urban issues at the university level of strategy. We'll also hear from our Design and Social Context College Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Tim Marshall, about the significance of urban research to our college's agenda, an important umbrella frame that Kerr contributes to. And later on, we'll also hear from Professor Catherine Johnson, who's the Associate Dean for Research within the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies, and our incoming Dean of the school in 2023. The detailed program for the event is available through the QR codes on your table. If you want to see further details of all of our panelists, we'll have Tom's comments then, our first panel, and take a brief break at 4 o'clock. Then we'll go to the second session, and then we'll conclude by 5 p.m. After which moment refreshments will surely be deserved. So, without further commentary from me, I'd like to welcome Professor Tom Bentley to the stage to offer some brief remarks on urban research within RMIT's university strategy. And thank you for joining us today, Tom.
Thank you very much, Jago. Thanks for the invitation and the welcome, and thank you for your acknowledgement of country and affirmation of our respect to Aboriginal and First Nations people in our community and the country on which we function. I will try to be brief. I want to begin with congratulations to the Centre for Urban Research and the collective achievement of you all and that has been built over this decade. And I'll touch on why I offer those congratulations in what I want to say. It's my second go round in supporting the development of a university strategy at RMIT, and we had the good fortune to do it through the experience of a global pandemic, which meant that the process of developing the strategy, as perhaps all of you know, many of you know, took almost 3 years in itself, and was interwoven with a set of experiences and pressures on everybody, not just in our university, but in the surrounding community, which forced questioning of what's the role of a strategy, what's the role of a university, what's happening to the systems of shared life around us, and what does it mean to sustain ourselves and develop a set of goals and actions that might take us towards a shared and inclusive future, which is part of the vision that our RMIT embraced through our strategy process, directly influenced by input and commentary, expertise and critique from RMIT's urban scholars and the wider community. The place of urban research in our strategy is similar to the place of urban research in the life of the university. And of course, our urban nature as RMIT has been referenced in past strategic documents. But part of my reflection, part of my observation in thinking about this, knowing RMIT for many years before I got to join as a staff member, was that one of the perennial challenges of strategy, which is it's easy to make the bullet points, it's hard to get them to count in practice, culture and learning outcome over time. And my reflection is that RMIT, as much as any other university that we might identify, is an institution of the city because of its mission, its provenance, the way that it's developed, and its specialisms and collections of expertise. And because of that fact, because of the expertise and the collective web of relationships built up by RMIT's community, we have an opportunity to influence and contribute to the development of the city in all of its forms. And in my interpretation, that's what the Centre for Urban Research, can't quite bring myself to call you Kerr. No, I can. It really excels in. And so it's half an accident, but it's not entirely an accident. It reflects strategic circumstance that RMIT is an applied university, not only in Melbourne, but in other dynamic urban centres in parts of the world that are either widely influential because of their contribution to urban development and creativity, such as Barcelona, and other cities that are pivotal, potentially creative and influential in a wider regional transformation, such as Singapore, Hanoi, and Ho Chi Minh City. Of course, our collective network extends much further than that. But if there's a central shift of emphasis and a perspective that emerged out of this strategy cycle and the experience of working to build a strategy for the whole university that reflected our responsibilities and our potential contribution during this time of great crisis, I guess it's the perspective that RMIT has a potential to contribute, not because it holds a special status or a special form of expertise which it owns or exclusively maintains, which can be separated from our urban context or the society in which we live and work, but actually because RMIT is embedded in that society. And that's the way that we function, from campus life to workforce and employment relations, to the way that we draw our student catchments, to the outworkings of our collaborative research impact and our partnerships with other institutions around us, neighbouring institutions and networked institutions, all reflect those interactive relationships. So it's not an accident that the strategy, in seeking to clarify both purpose and focus, came to three relatively simple points of definition about education, about research and innovation, and about community and community service, noting the way that Jago expressed our commitment to service in your words. But the strategy is actually very much about articulating RMIT's specific, applied, situated forms of commitment to those, and looking for ways of building better, more creative, more collaborative interactions between them. That's why the heart of the strategy is a a commitment to community. Tim Marshall pointed out the other week that community is the most common word in the strategy document. Apparently comes up 64 times. Who's counting? And that in the way that we articulate it, the idea of an open, diverse and collaborative community is fundamental. Now, what that means, what it should mean in the different locations, among the different constituencies, among different demographic cohorts from generation to generation, is all open to consideration, discussion, contest, experimentation. But for me, what it leads to is a reinforcement of the idea that as an institution, in order to serve our communities, contribute to our fundamental purposes, and learn how to function and thrive in a changing society, which is impacted by a changing environment and changing technologies, we need this continuous process of iteration and integration between different forms of knowledge and the perspectives of different parts of our community. And that for me is exactly what CUR has achieved, both through its commitment to deep expertise, to rigorous research, to evaluation and to contributing to the evidence base, but also through its curiosity and its pragmatic commitment to taking meaningful opportunities, working with many different groups, serving the interests of students and industry and community partners, as well as contributing to recognised forms of excellence in the research community. So that brings us to the set of future opportunities and challenges which RMIT aspires to lead in through this strategy. They're also arrived at through the same kind of iterative method and dialogue, if you like, to address emerging technologies, social innovation, smart and sustainable cities, and regional collaboration, particularly across our Southeast Asian and Asia Pacific region, in order to contribute to future well-being and sustainability, and to help to generate insight and understanding that can be used for benefit across the whole community. So it's in that, for me, it's in those four areas that the opportunities to build on your collective achievement and to focus and integrate potential solutions is greatest. And we already see it playing out in a whole range of different ways through applied research and indicator projects, through the many different contributions that CUR researchers and PhD students and others make to public discussion about the future of our cities, through the pursuit of a social innovation precinct in the City North area of RMIT City Campus, and through the incredibly important regional collaborative relationships and networks that we're all engaged in pursuing. If there's a challenge, it's that there's so much that could be done. The kind of working complexity of being connected across so many different transdisciplinary perspectives and having the kind of ethos and commitment that you do to making a productive, constructive contribution. But I think that collectively you also do a great job of that, maintaining a sense of sustainability. And I look forward in a pragmatic sense through the three-year cycles of RMIT's new strategic plan to trying to help pick up on the most important connections and opportunities and think about how this body of collaborative transdisciplinary effort can make its greatest contribution and sustain itself over time. So congratulations again, and thank you very much.
Well, hi, thanks. I'm just expecting my panel to come too. So I'm Andrew Budd. I'm the Associate Dean of Sustainability and Urban Planning, and I'm the first host of one of our panels, which is more of a kind of, I suppose, retrospective panel. I'm joined by some people I'll introduce in a second. I was joined RMIT in 2018, and I would say that I was very the Centre for Urban Research was certainly one of the reasons I saw this as a great opportunity to come to RMIT. And that was when the centre was, I suppose, getting close to half a decade old, or a bit older. And in the last half a decade, of course, there's been some dramatic changes, like everyone going home sometime in March in 2020, and things changing in the way that we related, the way we connected as scholars, and the way we talked with our partners. But it's certainly been a great opportunity for me to expand my networks of people I work with in industry, amongst other scholars, and of course including internationally at RMIT. So I wanted to introduce the panel we've got here first. First I'll introduce Emeritus Professor Robin Goodman, who's formerly a Director of the Centre, as well as a former Dean of the School of Global Urban and Social Studies. Kath Phelans works with Infrastructure Victoria, I was going to say, and also formerly had undertaken work with Kerr. Ian McShane is the former Deputy Director of the Centre for a time, over a few years until last year, I believe, the year before last, I believe. And Joe Hurley, who is an active researcher in the Centre and has been formerly the Associate Dean of the Sustainability and Urban Planning Program. But first I was going to ask Robin to give us a short, I suppose, brief summary of Kerr's history, in addition to that which Jago's given. Hopefully not just repeating all of it, but there's some interesting asides as well.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much. Can you hear me? I'm shorter than most people, so. Yes, I'll cover a little bit of the same ground, but this will be from my perspective and hopefully not too repetitive. It's common to say, you know, it doesn't seem like 10 years, but gee, it seems a long time ago, the things that I'm about to talk about, to me anyway. I don't know how it all feels to you. Too loud. As it's already been said, and as many of you would know, the Centre for Urban Research grew out of RMIT's AHURI Research Centre. Tell me if that's too loud, by the way, or too soft. No, you're right. And I became the director of that research centre, I think in 2009. I'd written down 2010, but it was probably 2009, taking over from Gavin Wood, who's here, and he may remember exactly the date. And it's also great to see Mike Berry, who was the first director of RMIT's research, AHURI Research Centre, here today too. Back then, it was a small but very effective cohort of researchers, primarily focused on work related to the AHURI National Housing Research Program. There were about 5 staff and 2 PhD students and a full-time professional staff member supporting them, luxurious by today's standards. We were housed in Building 15, away from the rest of what was then the School of Global Studies, Social Science and Planning, known affectionately as GOSSIP. I'd moved over from a role in the Environment and Planning teaching team, where I'd been program coordinator of the master's program for about 4 years previous. And I tried to increase the connections between that AHURI group and the Environment and Planning teaching team, and to broaden the number and range of people applying for AHURI grants, not just from our school, but from across the university. And for a few years there, we were putting in record numbers of applications and achieving a good percentage of grants. And I can see Michael here from AHURI. I don't know if Anne's here, but she would remember those times well. Staff in what was then the Environment and Planning group, like Michael Buxton, who's here, and Paul Mees and Susie Maloney and others, Jan Schurer, who I've seen today, were increasingly undertaking and publishing research on a wide range of issues, but were separate organisationally, and many didn't really feel a part of the AHURI Centre. In maybe 2011 or 2012, our research centre grew in numbers, with initially 6 staff joining us from what had been the Centre for Design in the college as it underwent a major transition. And this group included Cecily Maller, who's still with us, which is terrific, sitting up the back there, and Yolandi Strengers, who's now a professor at Monash. They were terrific additions to the centre. And then shortly after that, in 2012, we were approached by another small research group of climate change researchers, led by Hartmut Fundgeld from Maths and Geospatial. And so this centre started to grow. And we also around that time got Ian McShane and Chris Wilson, who'd come across from Swinburne University with Denise Meredith. So this was the beginning of what David Hayward, who was then the Dean of the school, and I used to refer to as our mergers and acquisitions policy, in order to build a larger and more influential and successful centre. Around this time, we also persuaded Sarah Beckersey's research group working in Interdisciplinary Conservation Science to formally become part of the centre. We thought it was necessary to have a name that now reflected the range of researchers and breadth of research undertaken in the centre, and to work out a structure to encompass the larger and more diverse group. And Jo Hurley was given time allocation as a deputy director to work out a process and structure that all those people involved were happy with. We initially chose the name Urban Research Centre as being broad enough to be able to include almost everybody, and then had to reorder the words when we found out there was a new policy saying that all research centres had to begin with the words Centre for. So I became the inaugural director of the Centre for Urban Research in 2012. And then in 2013 handed the job over to Hartmut Funfeld as I was asked to return to lead the teaching program. The environment and planning area, which around this time had changed its name to Sustainability and Urban Planning, had been really successful in building up a large postgrad program, initially under Michael Buxton's leadership. And we had the only undergraduate planning program in Melbourne. So I used to claim that we were the largest planning program in Victoria and then in Australia, based on the number of graduates we were producing, and I might say without a lot of data to support the claim. But this then led a few of us to believe that we should aim to have the largest and most successful urban research centre in Australia. So I was happy to take that on as our ambition. There was and is some competition in this space, but belief and intention can get you a long way. Apart from size and reputation, our other clear ambition was to achieve the highest ranking of 5 in the ERA for urban planning under the Urban Planning Code. The goal of a 5 for 1205, as our slogan went, seemed clearly attainable, as we'd achieved 4 in each of the ERAs conducted so far. And it was particularly pushed by our late colleague Paul Mees, who took the case for further support in the form of staffing positions to enable its achievement to the then Vice-Chancellor Margaret Gardner. She was supportive and agreed to some further resourcing, although in the end I think it amounted to just 1 year's salary for one position. And even though actually small, the support from the Vice-Chancellor and more locally and emphatically from the Dean, David Hayward, was critically important to our sense of ambition and direction. David allowed me to replace staff who left the discipline, not with very entry-level ECRs, but with academics with just a few more years' experience who are already showing a strong research trajectory. Planning is a relatively small discipline and planners are a social and well-connected lot. So I was able to personally talk to people who I thought would be good, talking up our ambitions at conferences and other gatherings. In this early phase of the mergers and acquisitions policy, we were joined by people like Jago Dodson, Wendy Steele, Marco Amati and Crystal Legacy, who's now gone on to the University of Melbourne. We were also able to attract others through the Vice-Chancellor's Fellowship Scheme, through which we got Libby Porter, Liz Taylor, who came and went a bit back then, and later Hannah Badlands, and a host of other terrific people who I just can't name everybody individually, and I'm sorry if I've left you out. I would mention just also, as Jago has, the large group we got led by Billy Giles Courtype of the Healthy Livable Cities group later on chronologically, but a terrific boost to the centre. So you can see by this description that my approach, our approach to building up a research centre was to recruit the best people we could. Others might have approached it differently by chasing funding first, for example, getting a large external grant. And that can work, but it wasn't our approach. I believed if we had good people and emphasised how good it is to work in a collaborative and supportive environment with great colleagues, then grant and publication success would follow. And at the very least, we would have fun chasing that success. I wanted the centre to be a place that nurtured good researchers, not just those on fellowships or externally funded, but regular teaching academics who'd be encouraged and supported to work collaboratively on research projects that could then inform their teaching. All the teaching staff became members of the centre. We are an applied research centre which has always valued impact and engagement, and this emphasis is of course part of the AHURI model, to produce research that can inform policy and practice. And although the Centre for Urban Research is no longer named as RMIT's AHURI Centre, the AHURI core is still an important part of the research that it does, and we still take part, I believe, successfully in AHURI research rounds. So to conclude, because I'm sure that's my time gone, I am very proud of this centre, and although I had a key role in the early formation, its success in recent years is of course due to a host of other people. I became occupied with being the Deputy Dean as it was then, and then the Dean of the school for 4 years and finished up at the end of 2020. Very many people have contributed to the centre's success in the last 10 years, but I'd particularly like to thank and pay tribute to Jago Dodson, if it doesn't sound like I'm just returning the thanks. But he's done a fantastic job. He's been in the role since either the very last bit of 2014 or the beginning of 2015, and he's really enabled the centre to grow and flourish. It's not yet reached its full potential, of course. We never did get that ERA 5 in urban planning. The centre is now in a position to work more internationally and to establish stronger partnerships and chase larger sources of external funding. So I really believe and hope that the best is yet to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Thinking maybe that's why they cancelled the ERA. They was kind of just afraid of what could happen. I wanted to go to the rest of the panel and ask a few questions and maybe reflect on thoughts that Robin had and relationships between what she said and other areas of, I suppose, university and broader public life. And I was going to actually start externally, Kath, to ask you, I suppose, to maybe reflect on the role for university research centres like the Centre for Urban Research in areas of public policy and in areas of evidence making, if you like, and what works well, what has worked well by having a centre with scale like this, and where do you think we might go with that?
Well, thanks, Andrew, and thank you so much for inviting me to come back. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces. I've had the pleasure of working with so many of you either while I was here and also post working at RMIT. So the first thing I would say is you do amazing research. You are extraordinarily generous with your research and with your time, with your responsiveness. You make our lives in government so much easier because you give us fabulous evidence. So I think that for me, I mean, you've mentioned evidence, obviously, Andrew. We at Infrastructure Victoria, we advocate and try to influence government using evidence. And you provide us with wonderful evidence. You fill gaps in knowledge, you create new knowledge, and that is vitally important in government, particularly in government where decisions aren't always necessarily made on the best evidence. But we at Infrastructure Victoria we are able to actually publicly use evidence to advocate for better public policy, especially around infrastructure. But we, of course, are also very interested in the integration of infrastructure with land use planning. For me, sort of looking back at my time at Kerr and the projects I was involved in, the work that I was fortunate to do here has remained incredibly relevant. And I think that's another thing, that your research, it isn't just an article that gets published, then everyone moves on. No, that work continues to be really, really important. The work that Kerr has produced on Melbourne's growth areas has, Robin started some of the early work there, and then it's just grown through what has happened in the Centre for Urban Research. The Salandra Rise project was a fundamental, step in actually having a look at what was happening in those brand new suburbs. And then, of course, the early delivery of transport options in our new suburbs has been so fortunate. That project was so fortunate to then have the Healthy Livable Cities group as well come in there. And so there's all this evidence there for these new places on the edge of our city, and lessons from those, of course, are also relevant elsewhere. Transport, it's not just about planning, it is also very much about those transport issues in those new places. The second area that I was involved in was looking at land supply. We did this terrific project looking at Melbourne's land supply. Well, this remains incredibly relevant because we have a strategic planning document for the city that talks about trying to get more development into our established areas. We were looking at the capacity of the city to do that. We continue to do that work today at Infrastructure Victoria, trying to look at these policies that state government has set and the real challenges to actually achieving those. So some of that work was really fundamental. The work that Michael and Andrew did on the peri-urban, still a gap in state government, still not enough action in that area. So again, that evidence is so important to actually have that out there in the public. And then finally, looking at urban greening, it was just, as each day passes, becomes more and more important. And Joe's work, working closely with state government to actually get really useful data that shows change over time. Now the challenge is getting that data updated. But these, again, just really, really important, great example of working closely with government on an issue that was important then and continues to be important in the future. So yes, I think it's a fabulous place to work. You do terrific research, so useful for government. Please keep those doors open, keep being responsive, and understand that you too, like we try to be at Infrastructure Victoria, you are also very much influencing government policy.
I just will ask, the doors are locked now, so who can answer us, but if for example, we just had a state election last weekend, what would be 3 kind of key words you think an urban researcher in Victoria should be thinking about for 2023?
Well, I still think peri-urban is key coming out of COVID. Our modelling and census shows that people are interested in living further away from the centre of Melbourne, and that is in direct contradiction with the stated sort of government policy. So peri-urban would be definitely one. Public transport, particularly for places that don't really have any options, still remains a huge issue. And I think growing spatial inequity. That's something that we all, I know, are very aware of, but what can we do about it?
Yeah, thanks, Kath. Joe, I was going to ask you something next. Robin mentioned in her précis the sense of an urban research centre, but also active people involved in teaching and research roles. I thought maybe you could reflect a bit on the way you see university research centres like Kerr working as they do, but also better in linking both teaching and research, but also people who aren't just always active research or full-time researchers in growing their capacity to be part of research activities.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, lovely topic. My mic is on. Can you hear me okay? Yep, great. Well, great honour to be here and amazing to see so many familiar faces. It's kind of overwhelming to see so many colleagues in the one space. It gives kind of physical presence to the numbers that Jago quoted before and how big and influential Kerr is, but also how familiar it is, even to me, who's been a little bit detached from it for various other roles I've been involved in over the more recent years. The relationship between the teaching side of things at RMIT and the research side of things, this is going to be a little bit of an introspective comment, I think, but a lot of people from RMIT in the room, is I think from my point of view, one of the most successful contributions of the Kerr journey, and both Jago and Robin alluded to it, is the way that over the last 10 years we've brought together the kind of program delivery, program innovation, teaching and undergraduate and master's student side of what we do with the amazing research capability and energy that we have in the urban space at RMIT through the Centre for Urban Research. When I finished my PhD, which I did do here at the Centre for Design, I was in Building 15 for those who were part of that era, the research building, We had Centre for Urban Design. Sarah was there with the Icon group. There was the AHURI guys doing their housing stuff up on the 4th floor, and the poor old PhD students stuck up on the roof in the kind of almost demountables. There was a pretty strong research culture over there, but the PhD students really felt like they were shoved away. I was then parachuted over into Building 8, into this teaching program, the kind of craziness of teaching delivery. But then I was surrounded by all these people doing amazing research, Michael and Paul and others. And I just couldn't understand why these worlds were so different. And that, as Robin has outlined, I think was a big drive in those early years, was bringing that together. And Robin's talked about mergers and acquisitions and going out and headhunting. But I think quickly we also, and you alluded to it, Andrew, we became a place where people in our community wanted to be. And not just everyone wanted to be, but people who wanted to be part, to make impact through their research on community for community outcomes, but be part of community. Not kind of the sole trader, the kind of competitive entrepreneurial model of research that can take over, I think, in the sector, but a place where people actually want to come and meet new people, make new intellectual and beyond connections, and be part of something that was more than just the sum of its parts. And the success that has manifest, I think, in the teaching side of our discipline areas really gives evidence to that success. We have a group of academics in the teaching program, quote unquote, who are some of the most productive, influential academics in our discipline areas in the country. And they are integrated into Kerr. They collaborate with, full-time researchers in Kerr. They have PhD students sitting a few metres away doing their work in Kerr. And that is, for me, what is the most powerful kind of impact of the last 10 years in that Kerr adventure.
Thanks, Joe. And I mean, I think it's a good reflection because it can be very separate in lots of universities and it can be very competitive. The separateness can be a sort of competitive agenda that lots of people hold very dearly, but I think we've broken that apart to a large extent. Ian, I wanted to ask you maybe a little bit about your role as Deputy Director, but also as someone who doesn't have a kind of a, transport planning background or anything like that. How you think the breadth and range of discipline areas that we've encompassed in urban research, and everyone's alluded to them, there's people here in the room from health sciences backgrounds, from physical sciences and biological sciences backgrounds. How have you felt that that's worked well to bring those things together, and particularly from your perspective as sort of someone who is adjacent to those what might be seen as the core disciplines in the original centre's conception?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks for the invitation to speak. It was initially something I had to think deeply about, because when I came to RMIT, I came out of the museum field and spent a number of years wrestling with Ashton Raggett McDougall, the architects of the refit here. And although that pointed me in a certain direction, an interest in design and spatiality and so forth, and also in culture and the cultural economy of cities, there was some discussion as to whether I would join the Faculty of Education, Media and Communications, or GUSS. And I was very interested in joining GUSS, and particularly the Centre for Urban Research, because I thought, in fact, those sets of interests converge around urban studies and urban research. So one of the potential criticisms of the Centre for Urban Research is that there is no centre, but indeed that is one of its strengths, its plurality of interests. And I hope, for example, I'm not stealing Wendy Steele's thunder, but we've just completed a manuscript on hot cities, and we have entitled Hot Cities, and we've argued very strongly that the only way to tackle an enormous problem that we are confronted with in climate change and the growing issue of hot cities is through interdisciplinary research. So across the span of the centre's interests, we have social infrastructure, culture and library and museum studies, education, transport, land use planning, urban greening, sustainability in its many forms, housing, transport, and the list goes on. I particularly welcomed the arrival of colleagues Hannah and Melanie and co when they brought a social epidemiological perspective to urban studies, which then enabled them to build models and develop really powerful evidence. And I have to pay an absolute tribute to the sort of sets of indicators and the capacity to synthesize really important data and put it into not only a narrative but also a usable framework for people in the Department of Treasury and so on. So I think that, looking forward, these sorts of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary conversations, the ability to look at the cultural, the economic, the environmental and the social dimensions of cities and small towns, of course, because they are urban as well. And your work, Andrew, in conjunction with Michael and others on peri-urban regions is super important. Having spent some time recently in the regions and realising that government policy in Victoria and elsewhere is still very Melbourne-centric. You don't have to get too far out until you run into the problem of thin infrastructure and thin labour markets and service markets and so forth. So I think that span of interests is very important as we move into the 21st century and tackle some of the enormous and wicked problems that confront us in major metropolitan areas and beyond.
Thanks, Ian. I just want to also thank Ian, particularly for the role of Deputy Director and the role in our teaching programs. Ian's retiring at the end of this year to continue to be involved with the centre, I hope. But to go and spend more time in a...
yes, well, that's right. Well, I will join my colleague Gavin Wood on the crossbenches in what he terms researchment rather than retirement. But just by way of Deputy Director, it did for me provide an opportunity to strengthen the link between the teaching area SUP and the Centre for Urban Research. And I remember, I think, Joe, you were the Associate Dean at the time when we had a desperate need for somebody to step in to take the urban planning and research project that runs every year in the Masters as a sort of final semester length course in the Masters program. And I put my hand up, and it's rather dominated my life for the last 5 years, but I thought that was a tremendous opportunity to try and bring those two arms more closely together. And there are lots of people in the room who I have tapped on the shoulder sometimes several times to come and do a guest presentation or spend half an hour talking to a student who's doing a project on a particular area that they are experts at. And nobody ever said no.
Yeah, and that range of expertise is actually fundamental to making that work. A question I suppose could be for anyone, but maybe for Kath and Joe to start with, which is, you discussed Ian about the multidisciplinarity of it. In communicating your research to government or working government, having research communicated to you, there's the broad breadth, there's the breadth, if you like, and the multidisciplinary nature of work like this matter, or is that just confuse people who have got a particular kind of focus and drive for things? I mean, are we on the right track in trying to encompass things in a multidisciplinary manner?
Oh, it's vitally important. And certainly every day at Infrastructure Victoria, we're arguing for better integration. I mean, for us, it's integration of infrastructure, land use planning, but it is thinking about all those different infrastructure sectors. So for us, we're talking about health, we're talking about transport, we're talking about the environment, we're talking about economic. We operate like that in our organisation. And so we are always looking for research that can do that, really high quality research that does precisely that. So absolutely. Really,
what do you think, Darren? I mean, that's not always the case, though. So what do you think in communicating things like urban change and urban heat, for example? As an example, it's got a range of disciplinary needs and outputs.
Oh, no, I think I'd agree with what Kath said. And to go further, I think in terms of particularly in working with government, the language of, discipline and multidiscipline is not really one that they're interested in. It's the capability to help us with the problems, the complex problems that we have, which requires multiple discipline contributions. But I think it's our job in those relationships to bring together that capability in ways that work really effectively, to work well together in meaningful ways, so that we can then work with those partners to answer the questions they have, to provide the evidence that they need to get past the hurdles in front of them.
There's always also the necessity to frame this in terms of a narrative, because policy is essentially storytelling. It's a form of storytelling. I think it's really important to be able to have the breadth of knowledge and awareness and language to be able to convey, to convey the data in meaningful ways. And, I see that as being as an important narrative requirement that it is in front of us all.
So Robin, in terms of original thinking then, I mean, did that work well at university at the time? And have you seen that change over time, the ability to kind of communicate the idea that something might be broad and multidisciplinary and require kind of skills that are quite disparate? It can be challenging in the structure of university too.
Yes, I was thinking before, because I mentioned going to Margaret Gardner. Back then, the university's slogan was global, urban and connected. And I always felt that that's exactly what we were, that the Centre for Urban Research was trying to be all those things, Certainly the school was. It was perfect for us. Sadly, after a while, they dropped the urban. But getting back to... Sorry, apologies to Tom, but I haven't read the new strategy yet, so I'm sure I'll do it soon. Sorry, but I'm losing the thread of your question. I mean, we were always trying to be interdisciplinary, but the more diverse groups within the centre really helps with that too, because each person can't be across everything, but they know who is, or they know who they can add in. So in terms of getting teams for either teaching, bringing in people to talk to students, but also for projects, I think we've just got such a wealth of people to draw on, and also the centre has fairly strong values. We haven't really talked about that, but I mean, Kath, you talked about social inequity. I mean, that's none of our main core, but that's behind what everybody does. I think concerns about the inequalities. And what the urban policies and structure of cities is doing to make things worse.
Well, I suppose before we wrap up, I mean, wonder if any of you about reflection of what might need to happen next, and
isn't that
Josie is still going to be actively in the centre in future, so the other people have got a chance to stay and think. What does the Centre for Urban Research need to do in coming years to maintain its relevance and maintain its impact?
Or increase it.
Or increase it, indeed.
Let's be ambitious here.
I think from a perspective of someone who works in government, if you can communicate your work through means other than in academic journals, that is very, very helpful. I still think that Joe and Liz's article on the planners don't even read the stuff is really, really relevant. It's absolutely the case. I am very, very fortunate to be a senior industry fellow here at RMIT, which gives me access to your wonderful library. But that's a rare thing in government. And while we have a government library service, it's good, but it's not great. So if you can get your work out into the public in ways that's really accessible, get that evidence out there, but making it clear that it has been peer reviewed, because we get asked that all the time as well when it comes to grade literature. But I think for me and from the perspective of government, get that work out there in a multitude of different ways.
I think there are two issues that we need to address in the next couple of decades and perhaps beyond. And one of them, of course, is the long-term problem of climate change and how we respond to the multiplicity of issues there. And the second is a bit more specific to rethink after COVID, and that I reminded that in 1995, Tom Bentley published a book called The Return of the Local. Now, we're always returning to the local, but I think this is now a new research agenda that the centre can very usefully focus on from a multiplicity of dimensions.
Joe, your plan?
Well, to give the following panel its oxygen, I'll focus on something a little less forward-looking, and that is to not break what we've built and celebrate, which I think we're doing tonight. And fantastic, Jago, for organising this and putting it on, the work you've done, leading the centre, because it's a really special place, and don't want to get caught up in too much kind of growth fetish. Let's keep nurturing what we've got and making sure we have a really vibrant community of researchers developing the future of our kind of intellectual disciplines that we represent, and contributing fantastic research to the community.
Right. Thanks, Robin, for your reflection. It's great to hear a comprehensive account of, particularly a moment of change in how an institution works. So it's really, so thanks to all of the panel. I think we've got a short break for a minute. Is that correct? 5 minutes? Yeah, and then we're back here. So are we going to get up and disappear or just chat? Thanks a lot.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, could I ask you to reclaim your seats? Okay, so we'd like to keep moving. This session sits between you and the refreshments that are being assembled out there. So thanks. So we're really fortunate this afternoon to have been joined by Tom Bentley, who offered some thoughts on behalf of the university. Obviously, the Centre for Urban Research sits within a school, which in turn sits within a college, and so we're really pleased to be able to be joined by the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for the College of Design and Social Context, Professor Tim Marshall, who's made himself available today to come and offer some thoughts on the context within the College for Urban Research and the role that urban research can play within the College of Design and Social Context. So thank you, Tim, for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Jago. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting to reflect on that title to the extent that actually the college's research agenda is very much informed by the work that's going on in KUR. So this is a two-directional information. Well, our strategies, our direction and pathways forward are very much based on the work of all of the academics and the students and staff here doing this work. And then that is basically showing the path forward. But as you heard, I am indeed Tim Marshall, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of RMIT's College of Design and Social Context. And it is a great pleasure to be with you today to celebrate 10 years of the Centre for Urban Research. It's a really significant milestone, obviously, and an important moment to recognise the individual and collective achievements of all those who have been involved in the centre the researchers and our academic collaborators, as well as government, industry and community. So in the College of Design and Social Contexts, our mission is to draw on our multidisciplinary strengths to transform the future of peoples, cities, industries, and the biospheres we're all part of through teaching and research that is global in focus and practical in action. And as a university so ingrained in the fabric of its urban locations, here in Melbourne, but we also have campuses in Ho Chi Minh, Hanoi, Barcelona, ingrained in our urban locations, we have a responsibility to proactively pursue sustainable futures broadly understood for our cities. CUR is central to how we are delivering on this mission and responsibility. And cities are obviously the crucible for humanity's experiments for how to live sustainably and equitably, and how to think and act with a planetary mindset. Networks of cities may well become new formations of decision-making and governance alongside the nation state as we go forward. Over the past decade, CUR has established itself as a world-leading urban research collective and has grown to be the largest of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere. And I can say that from my previous position in New York City, which you would think would be the easiest place in the world to do such a thing, we could never stand up an urban research centre, no matter how hard we tried. So it's fantastic work that's been going on here. A highly respected centre locally, nationally, and internationally, CUR's policy-relevant, high-impact research is making a tangible difference, and in many ways leading the conversation on a wide range of issues from First Nations land rights in the city to transport and mobility, climate change, policy and governance, and affordable housing and homelessness, among many other topics being researched. These are some of our most pressing issues of our time, and I'm extremely proud that RMIT and the Centre and the College for Design and Social Contexts is playing a significant role in how they are being addressed. And I firmly believe that the strength and success of RMIT's research centres, like CUR, is due to their collaborative approach and the coming together of people from diverse disciplines, which you heard a little bit about at the end of the panel just now. And it is indeed much more difficult to do than to say, and it takes a lot of effort and over a sustained period of time to make inter and transdisciplinary work actually work. So I'd like to acknowledge in closing and congratulate the CUR team and everyone else who's been part of the Centre for the past 10 years. The global need to intentionally shape cities that are environmentally, socially, culturally, and economically sustainable is increasingly critical, and I'm confident over the next decade, RMIT's Centre for Urban Research will be yet more impactful and consequential in this work. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Jacob, who's over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for your kind remarks, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us today for this event. So the next session is a panel session, which will be moderated by Professor Lauren Rickard. So I'd like to welcome Lauren to the stage now to introduce the panel, who can now take the stage. And I think Wendy Steele is going to kick things off with some opening remarks, but over to you, Lauren.
Great, thank you, Jago, and thank you to our panel here. So as Jago said, I'm Lauren Rickards. I'm the Director of the Urban Futures Enabling Impact Platform, previously known as the Enabling Capability Platform. And the first thing I'd like to say is that Bill and I have both really appreciated a very close relationship with CUR over the lifetime of the EIP, the Urban Futures, and really found a lot of inspiration and support within CUR. And I don't think Urban Futures would be so much on the cross-university agenda at that enterprise level if it wasn't for CUR. So there's a real impact internally in the university there to acknowledge. Now, my job here is to introduce this wonderful panel. And so let me start. At the far end, we have Susie Maloney, a dear colleague who was at RMIT, Associate Professor in Sustainability and Urban Planning in CUR, but is now the Executive Director of the Centre for Just Places at Jesuit Social Services, which is a centre set up by the Victorian Government and the Gandel Foundation to enable and support place-based approaches to addressing social and ecological justice issues. It does that through research, collaboration, engagement and knowledge exchange. So it's fantastic to welcome Susie back. We also have Michael, who's a long-term friend of Kerr and the Urban Futures, who's Managing Director of AHURI, so the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, which he's led since 2017. And in that role, responsible for setting the national research agenda, leading the curation of internationally recognised evidence, particularly for policy around housing, homelessness and many, many other urban issues. And Michael is on many expert panels, ministerial advisory panels, etc., and hugely influential in the housing sphere. We also have Hannah Badlin, who is our Deputy Director at Kerr and co-leads the Centre's Health, Place and Society research program. So Hannah is an extremely accomplished researcher herself, particularly focused on the built environment and its connections to health, well-being and inequities in both adults and children. And she particularly focuses on using interdisciplinary mixed methods approaches to understanding that, and hopefully we'll hear some about that today as well. And finally, we have Wendy Steele, Professor Wendy Steele, who's a sustainability and urban policy and also convener of the Critical Urban Governance Research Program in Kerr with Libby Porter. So Wendy has been prolific in recent years in terms of recent books, Planning Wild Cities, Quiet Activism, the Sustainable Development Goals in Higher Education, which I hear is a particularly excellent book. And has also been busy as chair of the 2021 State of Australasian Cities Conference and president of the Australasian Cities Research Network. So as you can see, we have a huge array of expertise across the diverse sort of big future urban transformation questions that we are facing. And to kick us off, Wendy's going to offer some opening remarks. Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I would also like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Bunwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands we conduct our business today, and respectfully acknowledge ancestors and elders, past, present and emerging. The lesson for cities, writes N.K. Jameson, is that they, much like any other living thing, are born, mature, get weary and die. As speculative fiction, Jameson writes about cities with soul, but also the dark sides that threaten to destroy them. She writes, they make a weight on the world, a tear in the fabric of reality, like black holes. And as more and more people come and deposit their strangeness and leave and get replaced by others, that tear in reality widens, and eventually it gets so deep that it forms a pocket connected by only the thinnest thread of whatever cities are made of. Jameson describes gaining inspiration for her work by starting with the end of the world. And that can mean the literal end of the world, the end of a civilization, or it can just mean grief. In her book, The City We Became, the protagonist is an ordinary citizen described as an urban midwife, breathing, stretching and massaging the city and all of its asphalt limbs. Or, as our colleague David Cullen, one of the founders of RMIT's non-fiction lab, describes, colonial settlements and their sediments need to be unsettled and dissolved into other flows. But we also need to find new ways to put our roots down. Bitumen, concrete, asphalt, steel, glass. These are the grammar of cities. Cars are the verbs. Apocalyptic visions of hot cities and their urban regions are now enmeshed in the climate crisis. Unlike that iconic colour image of Earth, the blue marble, taken by the Apollo 17 crew on their way to the moon in 1972, which appears to be without settlements, our cities are clearly seen from space. They appear not as tiny pinpoints on a natural landscape, but as brightly illuminated black and golden spider orb and webs that encase the entire planet. This is the urban inversion, where the ratio shifts from cities as small patches of grey amidst a sea of blue-green to small pockets of green dwarfed by seas of infrastructure. Cities and their regions now dominate our planet. They are humanity's greatest monster. They are humanity's greatest muse. As living environments, cities are home to human and more than human communities. As habitats, they can be extraordinarily ordinary, surprisingly rich in informal biodiversity, but they're never simply functional. Cities and their hinterlands offer shelter, security, food and energy, but also embody lived aspirations, desires and experiences of their communities. And this can be a living nightmare for the poor, the most marginal, the precarious, the outsiders, the strays, the disaffected, and those that have been colonised, silenced or oppressed. As nature's new wild, cities are being repositioned amidst the urgent need to better address the devastating impacts of modern urbanisation. This is a potent combination of urban, nature, culture and history that together make, as well as remake, the world that we know in and dwell. The 2022 IPCC report, Climate Change Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, that our legend Lauren here was a lead author on, makes clear that human and ecosystem vulnerabilities are deeply entangled. The relationship between humans and their urbanised environments has led to planetary scale system threats, tipping points and breakdown. Cities, through the burning of fossil fuels and other activities that feed progress and prosperity, are at the front lines of this climate crisis. The growth of cities and the reduction of biodiversity-rich green spaces impacts all species, with extinction rates of flora and fauna unacceptably high and continuing to rise. But dominant approaches to cities often miss the underlying foundations that structure in vulnerability and precarity. Normative responses to urban problems and challenges, be they sociological, ecological or economic, are too often grounded in an over-reliance on techno-scientific fixes, solutions, investment portfolios and risk management initiatives as the only way to fix the problem. And this approach overlooks understanding the who, the how, the why of cities and their trajectories of unsustainability, and importantly, how this might change. Urban dynamics are shaped by social forces of agency, structure, power, interest, resources, skills, capabilities. Critical governance challenges include financial arrangements, institutional structures, decision-making processes, risk trade-offs and security discourses. Political and policy responses are imbued with statutory force and strategic intent, and these forcibly work to shape and structure the experience of everyday urban life and vice versa. So we know sustainable futures have to be leaner and much, much greener. We know we need to address species extinction, ecocide, direct the critical role of technology to serve communities and not the other way around. We need to address geopolitical security, war and genocide, attend to food, shelter and water insecurity, the health imperative, planetary and otherwise, as well as reconfigure and reprioritise public transport, social and affordable housing, energy equity, and the vital recognition of First Nations rights and sovereignty. All cities in Australia are built on stolen Indigenous land, and the destruction of sacred Indigenous sites such as the Jawarong sacred trees and Yunkan Gorge is part of our ongoing settler colonial present, not history. So these are urban issues, and beneath these lie critical enabling questions for cities and their regions around equity, diversity, inclusion, institutions that are fairer and more effective, a social contract that attends meaningfully to questions of chronic poverty, redistribution, welfare versus liberty, and recognition that the urban world is not separate from, but intensely part of nature, and that the pathways of destruction and flourishment are shared planetary futures. Our colleague, international design futurist Tony Fry, highlights in his words some of the key challenges for cities. He says, there is at present an illusion of permanence and political myopia. the inability of people to imagine that what we are facing and to make decisions that recognise relational complexity and time, the ignorance of political leadership by people who are often not informed and don't understand the very situation they are trying to direct, the failure of education where people are taught about replicating practices of the past rather than developing the practices of the future. We are, he argues, inducting people into redundancy. And to address this, we need to explore and expose ideas across our disciplines and societies, creating collaborations and projects that show how different ways can be done moving forward, and that these differences become the basis for creative alternative practices and the potential for future learning. And so 10 years ago, the Centre for Urban Research was founded on the principles of ethics, equity and excellence in urban research that creates positive impact for diverse communities. And thanks to Robin and all of her work and the team that helped create this foundation. And these principles have not changed. But what has changed as we move into the next decade is existentially and intergenerationally, the stakes are so much higher now. The dark sides of cities as habitats so much more visible. We need to work differently to create meaningful and purposeful urban change. As Christina Figueres and Tom Rivetto-Carnac highlight from their experience with negotiations around the historic UN Paris Agreement, we will not have regenerative urban futures by default, but we can create them by design. With intentional, directional intent, we can shift our aspirations from our extractive growth trajectories to a life-sustaining society of regenerative values, principles and practices. But I'm going to close with some words from Indigenous Melbourne-based scholar Tyson Yunkaporta, who draws on insights from elders in his culture and community and argues that sustainability is about creation. Not as a verb, this is not a noun, but as a verb, creating continually unfolding futures. And as urban researchers, our task is to help lighten the weight of cities on the world, to co-create through radical practices of care and the ethics of regenerative repair, different, more sustainable and more sustaining urban futures. Thank you.
Wow, what an incredible, powerful statement. And it really does set the stakes for what we're talking about when we're talking about future urban transformations. One of the things that really resonated in what Wendy was just talking about was the fact that we are, whether we like it or not, in the midst of transformations. The world is transforming, cities are transforming, but the question is, which transformations do we want? And how do we cope with the unwanted ones as we pursue the desirable ones? Now, someone who's thought about these topics and is now working on them in a really intentional and I have to say very inspirational way is Susie in the Centre for Just Places, which has placed this idea of social and ecological justice at the heart of what you do. So when you look out across the future, which I believe you must have done setting up a centre from scratch over the last year or so, what urban transformations are really front of mind for you and others in the Centre for Just Places? And how do you see CURB working with you, or how could academia more widely work with you on that?
Thanks, Lauren. Can everyone hear me okay? I just want to say it's just, I feel like I've come back to an extended family's Christmas party, and it's been so long since I've seen many of you. And when Robin was talking about the history of how the centre came about, I all of a sudden felt very old and realised that I've been around and with both the Centre for Design, AHURI, the Environment and Planning Programme back when Michael Buxton was running it. Like, I've sort of had a taster of everything that Robin talked about in the last 20 years. So I guess I would sort of start just by saying thank you for having me back here, because I stepped out of RMIT in the middle of COVID which is the sort of thing that people seem to do. They did radical things during COVID just to add further disruption to their life. But I guess I've got a number of different thoughts. I guess one, before I kind of talk about just the stuff that we're doing in the Centre for Just Places, I would just say that all the words that have been mentioned this morning about the intentional way that you create a collegial work environment is just so not to be taken for granted. And I think it can't be taken for granted in any work environment, but particularly at universities. And I think it takes particular kinds of people to build that work culture and that collaborative culture over many years. And I think it's a fragile thing, and it's really based on who's in the room and the practices that you engage in. So I just want to sort of say how important it is going forward to keep that collaborative collegiality going, because it's actually not very easy in the world that we live in, because so much of what we do is relying on scarce resources. And so much of what is asked of us is to be competitive and often ego-driven. And it's one of the things that I think is just the antithesis of what transformation is asking us to sort of work on in the future. So I guess, but what I guess I'm thinking about is the sort of transformation that I sort of see, and I'm not going to speak specifically to urban issues, because I think everyone in this room has got a really good handle on the complexity of urban issues that we're facing. I think I'm thinking more about the nature of institutions and the nature of who we are as researchers, practitioners and activists, and actually what the current environment calls on us. And I think some of the things that Kath talked about, I guess similarly, we sort of find ourselves stepping out of the university and you realize how much is behind a paywall, which is super annoying. So it's helpful to have an RMIT address so I can still access all the research. But I guess I'd echo that point that Kath made about when you step out and you're working in a civil society context that I'm in right now, or working with policymakers, local governments, the community sector, there's so much that they can't access, that you can't read and that you can't find, or that's just not digestible time that people have to make decisions. So I just think in terms of the future challenge, and it is a really big challenge, is how you communicate complex ideas and make them meaningful and useful to people. I guess the other thing that I think about when it comes to transformation is what interdisciplinarity really means. And I felt like I was with such a great bunch of people over 20 years, but we all sort of had a shared understanding of what we were on about. At least I felt that we had a shared understanding. Our research reinforced each other. Our critical frameworks were very supportive of each other. As soon as you take that out and you bring it into an entirely different context, you have to totally change the way you talk about your issues. And talking about ecological justice inside Jesuit Social Services, who, for anyone who doesn't know, they've been around for 45 years and they're celebrating their 45th year. And as it turns out, I was just in the room with the entire organization this morning. There was 240 people in the room and it was their end of year celebration. And they have staff, 350 staff who work in Melbourne, in Western Sydney and in the Northern Territory. And they were all in the room this morning. And it was just amazing because I hadn't met them all because we formed during COVID. So I guess just one of the things I'm reflecting on is the fact that in one day I've moved from my new work environment back to my old work environment, and I'm trying to process what that actually means. And I suppose I'll just wrap it up just by saying, for me, it's about rethinking what a researcher is, and it's about rethinking where research happens and who are researchers, because one of the challenges that we face is an organization like Jesuit Social Services grapples with a whole lot of complex social issues. And then you say, and now let's think about climate change, and now let's talk about ecological justice. And for lots of people, they're going, well, that's not what we're about, supporting people going in and out of prison, or we're about supporting people with complex needs in housing. But when you actually talk about the whole idea of we live in a web of relationships, which is how our CEO talks about it, it makes complete sense that we can't disconnect. And I guess it just sort of echoes Wendy's lovely words, and I'll be paraphrasing in a very basic way, is I just think the fluidity of who we are as workers, as researchers and activists is something we have to actively think about. The fluidity of the role of institutions like researchers, like the centre, I should say, is something we have to actively think about and not get stuck in particular ways with KPIs and things like that. That's what it demands. That's what transformation demands, in my view. So,
yeah, absolutely. And just sort of picking up, I guess, that how questions, yeah, something Kath was talking about earlier about the importance of evidence to be able to have policy impact. So Michael and Hannah both produced a lot of evidence about some really, really important issues. I'm interested in how we can sort of reconceive the idea of evidence when we're talking about futures that are almost by definition going to be very, very different. So what does evidence about the future look like, and how does that alter how we go about research? Who wants to take it?
I think I'm up first. Thank you, Michael, for your generosity. So the opportunities around, I guess, for the centre in terms of research, I think it's very much around continuing the impactful pathway we've set up. I think RMIT, now the Knowledge with Action strategy, it's squarely in the minds of not only doing great research, but how you can actually make it accessible to those who need to use it, and make sure it really is grappling with these really complex problems. And the way that you do that is by the systems-based thinking, which has been said in many different ways today. Any answer is not going to be from one discipline or one lens of thought. And I think in terms of opportunity, I think really embracing Indigenous knowledge, I think that's something that coming from New Zealand, we've done it okay, but in Australia, there's a lot more to learn in terms of Indigenous knowledge and how we can actually, I was at a really great conference a while ago, and it was an Indigenous researcher talking about living on the land. And obviously there's been a lot of floods in Australia lately, but how Indigenous peoples actually knew about that, how they managed the land, how they migrated, all these things. So I think there's a lot of knowledge to be learned in terms of a true system. I think the international collaborations is going to be big, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, and thinking about how we can take learnings from a whole bunch of different people, but to understand huge urbanization pressures, which are most evident within Asia, how we can actually take the knowledge and build really resilient cities moving forward in a really honest collaboration of not being the people who know everything. And I don't think, for an instance, the centre has these views, but coming in a genuine commitment to finding solutions where everyone's equal and everyone has equal knowledge. And lastly, I think that it hasn't really been spoken about so much today, but the opportunities for big data and understanding how we can link really interesting data that have been collected for a variety of different reasons, but how we can actually link them in new ways to answer new questions. And given it's a really fiscally constrained environment, we've got these amazing data sets out there, and we've now got the technology to actually be able to pull together really big data sets and interrogate them in new ways. So I see a lot of opportunity in terms of big data for answering really complex questions where you can bring together all the great minds. There's talk now about the digital twins, and for those of you who don't know, I just copied our definition of them. Virtual models designed to reflect a real world setting. So that means you can do a lot of simulations to understand maybe some of the unintended consequences. And we don't do that so much in our centre at the moment, but that could be a real opportunity again for maybe giving people a bit of support in terms of, should I make decision A or decision B, but understanding maybe some of the implications of the choices. And the last thing, I'm just going to do a plug for the Australian Urban Observatory, which many of you will be aware of, but that is a really valuable dissemination tool in terms of taking a whole lot of research that's been quite it's quite complex and the conceptual underpinnings, but making it digestible in a way that can be really visual and easily explained. And I think if we can kind of keep that front of mind, that not only can we produce great research, but produce it in a way that's actually geared to our end users, I think that's is just a great outcome. And thinking about that infrastructure when we are designing our research, I think is really important. And to you now, Michael.
The problem with being polite and letting you go first is you've now said a lot of the things I wanted to. But I think just to come back to one of your earlier points, if we're going to think about the future of our cities, we need to think about the past or where they've come from and the fact that they're built on stolen land. So we need to actually better recognise that our First Nations people manage the land much better than we're doing now, and learn from that and think about our cities in ways that bring in that knowledge and manage that land better. And the climate change effects that we're seeing today and the natural disasters that we're contending with are a really good example of how we need to be thinking more about our environment and working with that in planning our places. I think, as well as getting a better understanding of places in that sense, we also need to understand a bit of detachment from place that's going on more and more, where working remotely has become very normal, become a part of not just desk workers, knowledge workers, everyday experience, but for many industries working remotely. So, you know, residential construction that's done off-site is now as good a quality as built on-site, and commercial construction off-site as well. So, you know, we're seeing a different relationship between how we live and work and the places we use. And I think understanding that's something we've got a lot more to do in that space. But I think, to come back to the question, which I haven't gone near yet, I think public dialogue is an increasingly important tool for us to use. And so, you know, the knowledge translation of research into public dialogue is a really important mechanism for AHURI and for KER. And so that engagement with the media, with events that are public facing, not just in academic communities, but with a wide range of industries and community sectors are essential. They're time consuming, but they're really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, as Wendy demonstrated with the beautiful piece she opened with, I mean, writing about cities in different registers. So, you know, we've talked about interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral, but it's also like inter-genre too, like moving across. So you're talking about the data, but you're also talking about, you know, cities in a more poetic register that really start to hit at different truths that you don't see necessarily through a map or through numbers or through, you know, carefully selected interview quote. So Wendy, I wanted to ask you, in your work, I mean, I think futures is always part of what you're doing, and grappling with this question of needing to deconstruct some existing trajectories in order to get across to others. I know, for example, you've looked at things like social innovation. What are some of the ways in which in your work you try to hold open those different futures and kind of create lines of vision through to what might be possible?
Thanks, Lauren. Jean Hillier, actually, Emeritus Professor here at RMIT, talks about, in relation to social innovation, the need to make and break connections. And often when we think about the futures, we think about constantly the need to create or innovate in new ways. But actually, as critical is recognising where things are broken or trajectories are unsustainable, and to take the necessary steps to break some of those connections so that at the same time you're making new ones. But I just want to highlight, Ian mentioned that we've been working on this book, Hot Cities, with John Hanmer, who's another emeritus professor here at RMIT. And we've been interviewing many people from a range of different disciplines, from history, philosophy, scientists, artists, poets, musicians, and the list goes on. And two provocations, if you like, have really intrigued me. And I was thinking about them as I was listening to the three of you speak, and I really appreciate all your comments. And I wonder actually what you think of this. So provocation number one is, despite all of the evidence and data that we have already collated in the academy and elsewhere, why are we going backwards in terms of sustainability? So why are we not getting traction with all of the busy work that we do moving forward? And the second question is that when policymakers or decision makers or politicians get the evidence, so say we're able to harness the evidence that we need to make good decisions, why does it seem so obvious that we don't have the skills or capabilities to make good decisions? So even when confronted with a lot of evidence, being able to weigh up and make choices around, risky decisions seems to be something that certainly we don't teach in our courses, that none of us seem to be doing very well. So I guess, I understand the point of evidence, but how do we account for those two seeming paradoxes?
Would you like to respond when you're dealing with ministers?
I think we can get attached to the notion of evidence-based policy, but it's a fiction. There is no such thing as evidence-based policy. Policy is driven by a whole lot of drivers, and evidence is one of them, but it's never the only one. You never have policy settings that are purely and solely driven by evidence. There are a whole lot of other voices that come into play, a whole lot of political considerations that come in. What we can aim for is evidence-informed policy, so that we can have an impact on the shaping of policy so that it's constructive and beneficial. But hoping that to be the only voice in the room is fanciful. It's not going to be. There are always commercial concerns, political concerns, other competing demands, competing resources for finite funds. Departments fight with each other over who's going to get the money, competing with Treasury. So we've got to be aware of that competitive environment and those other voices. And some of the other voices are supportive of what the evidence tells them, and some are not. They're working out of self-interest, and we have to be cognizant of that when bringing our voice to the public square, that it's not going to be the only one listened to.
And I suppose the follow-on question from that is, given that there's a range of factors that shape policy, as there should be, I would say, do we need to diversify what we think research and research centres and universities ought to be doing, and how they interact with policy in that wider world?
Yes, thank you. This is more of actually a follow-up. Sorry, Lauren, so it's not really your question, it's more a follow-up to Michael. But I think part of the issue with when we get disappointed that evidence doesn't become adopted in policy, I like the evidence informed, I think that's much more accurate, is that often researchers come to policymakers going, here's my research, it's fantastic, this is what you need to do. Anyone who's got small children and goes to and goes, do that, they're not going to do it, right? They do the total opposite. It's human nature. So I think it's more around thinking, now I'll get to your point, it's about thinking about how we can actually take people on the journey with us. So understand what is really important that needs to be addressed now, not what we think is important, but what's important from more of a policy landscape, which might be much more diverse with much more competing interests. And then actually understanding how to have those conversations early on and to actually be answering questions that are meaningful and therefore the outcomes are produced in a meaningful way. So it's not to say that you don't continue doing the research that interests you, but it's about taking people on the journey and the pathway to actually make it feel like it's a shared decision and a shared outcome. And I don't think we do that as well as what we could at this point in time.
And but just to also say that I think one of the things that sort of stood out from the first panel and the reflections from David and Robin is that, there's also been on a journey, and that we also need to alter and change. And I think that kind of reflexive, although there's been a lot of pride here today, I would say also a relatively humble approach to the work. It's very much grounded on the real issues, is one of the strengths of CUR. So we might leave it there. Clearly we could keep talking all evening, but could you please join me in thanking our panel?
Thank you very much, Lauren and our panel for that fantastic conversation. I'd now like to invite Professor Catherine Johnson to offer some remarks. In her current role as Associate Dean for Research within the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies, and as all of you in the room perhaps by now already know, Catherine will be our Dean from, I think, the 1st of February 2023. So welcome, Catherine.
Thanks, Jago. Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks for asking me to say a few words. I'd like to start by congratulating you, Jago, and Hannah for your exceptional leadership of KER over the last few years. So you've both been in those roles since I joined RMIT in 2018, and you've done a fantastic job. And leading through the COVID years has not been easy, and it's really testament to your leadership that you've actually kept that sense of research culture going and connection within the centre. So well done, both of you. I've really enjoyed hearing more about the work that you've done and the history, the development of the centre, and to see many of those people here today. I think that's also, testament to people's commitment to the centre. So that's been great. So the centre has been a huge success story for the school, for the university, for the city, and also for Australia. I think part of that, success is noted in their clear alignment with one of our discipline areas in the school. So KER's alignment with SUP area, and it's provided a really impressive research culture for staff and also students, or HDR students, and we shouldn't kind of underestimate that. You've asked me to say something about the sort of strategy and looking forward. I'm not actually the Dean yet, but I am being asked those questions quite a lot. Robin did tell me to start straight away, and I ignored that advice because I thought I'd like to have a holiday over Christmas and the New Year. But anyway, so I mean, I've had a few thoughts, and we've also had a few conversations. So I've already started talking to Jago and Hannah about ideas for next year, and how we might imagine the future of KER. Now, I think, one of the things that we've been talking about is kind of trying to have some organisation around the research power within the centre. There's a lot of research power in the centre. We've got a lot of leaders, professorial staff, and trying to kind of bring some of that together around some of these really big important themes like housing, like transport, like environmental sustainability, and I think particularly around healthy communities. So thinking about how people can kind of come together in those ways. We're going to be working, I think, in a more transdisciplinary kind of with connections across colleges. That fits with the kind of university strategy. But also, and I say this quite often, that actually we talk about cross-college collaborations, but we have two of the most successful centres in the school. So it's also about cross-school collaborations between our two research centres. This year, we welcomed the development of a new thematic cross-school we did a call, and we had an area around migration and urban change. And I think, again, and that's where I'm talking about the kind of urban connected, with kind of healthy community. So, and it was really fantastic to see that kind of initiative. And we want to see more of those initiatives. So both within the school, but also working across the college and elsewhere in the university. Okay, what else have I got for you for the next few years? So I'm continuing to expand the reach of the research that's already taking place in KER. So, we know that, it's a very impressive centre, but we want to be kind of moving into that regional and kind of globally through RMIT Europe. We've had success, certainly KER's had success in that area for RMIT Europe, but also working through connections through Vietnam and with other kind of parts, universities in the region. And then I think finally is this kind of sense about building more links between research and teaching. I think, KER and SUP do this quite well, but I think KER and SUP could help us do that more across the school. And I'm really keen to see that happening in the policy and impact space. So thinking about kind of how we are connecting between research and policy in kind of key areas. But also, and Hannah, you mentioned this a bit when you were up here, what I think what we could really be doing as well is harnessing the breadth and depth of research skills that we have, research methods that we have, to try and kind of reinvigorate our research training, you know, for our students, but also, you know, sending out graduates into the world who have some of those kind of research skills in terms of, you know, related to policy, but also related to kind of impact, you know, assessments, impact assessments, program evaluations, so that we're kind of doing a bit more of that kind of hands-on training, I think, within the research space. Okay, so as Robin said earlier, there's more to do. Okay. And I think, you know, with the issues of climate change and our kind of commitment to radical care for people and planet, you know, there are vital things for us to be doing. So I'd like to wish you all, you know, congratulations. Go and celebrate this evening, and then I'll see you back next year for the next chapter in Kerr's success. So, thanks.
Thank you, Catherine, for those thoughts. We've got quite an agenda ahead of us from 2023 and beyond. So look, we're at the end of the session for today, and drinks, I hope, are waiting for us out in the foyer there. But before we finish up, I'd just like to offer some thanks to everyone who's come along today, also to our speakers and our panelists and moderators. But also, I try to always do this when we hold an event, is to thank the people who've helped organise it, particularly Hannah Badland and Andrew Butt in academic roles, but also Jenny Lucy, who is our Impact and Engagement Officer within Kerr, and also Catherine Cox from the DSC office, who's also played an important role in that. These kind of events, although it's a relatively modest scale event tonight, still take a lot of organising and coordination, and I'm really grateful to Jenny and Catherine in particular for the support that they've provided. And I'd also note that over the life of the Centre for Urban Research over the last decade, we have regularly drawn on dedicated support from professional staff within RMIT who don't necessarily get acknowledged in some of the academic conversations. I particularly recognise Selena Lim, who was the original administrator of the centre, people like Cassandra Coates, who was the GUSS Research Services Coordinator for a while, Violetta Trysevsky, who was our coordinator for a while before she took a secondment to RNI, Catherine Cox more recently in that role, and also Chanel Coleman, who was our communications officer until she disappeared off on parental leave and didn't come back. She was going to come along tonight. I'm not sure if I can see her in the audience, but Chanel did a terrific role, played a terrific role with our communications. And also at the school level, people like Mark Newman, who's the school manager, who's not necessarily very visible to most people in the Centre for Urban Research, but I certainly find that in my role, Mark's very measured and careful approach to advising on how to navigate the complexity of RMIT, both in terms of financial and other kinds of processes, is really invaluable, as has been the support from Sue Bennett in the school HR role, and also Yota Giannoulis in the school executive assistant role, which sometimes I wonder if really RMIT's challenges and problems could be solved if we just put Yota in charge of things. But so far that hasn't happened, but perhaps she's secretly running the university from where she sits in the school. But no, the school professional staff team in GUSS is really tremendous, and they've been really important in supporting Kerr over the years. So I just wanted to mention that. So look, thank you all for coming along tonight to help us celebrate this 10 years of the centre. It is a slight indulgence to reflect on what we've done. But as I mentioned at the start, you know, these kind of enterprises, these kind of ventures within the university sector, which itself is constantly changing as cities are changing, so are universities. I think it is important to take a moment from time to time to pause and reflect on success, acknowledge it, celebrate the work that we put in and the rewards that it's generated, and look to the future as to where we might go from that point. So thank you all for coming along and celebrating and reflecting on the centre tonight. And please thank each other for all the work that you've done over the years in various ways. I should also thank our various stakeholders who are here tonight, people that we've worked with closely, whether in, say, a research funding format, such as Michael Fotheringham from AHURI, or others who we collaborate with, such as the Planning Institute. We really value the connections that we've built external to RMIT with our valued supporters. Drinks and nibbles are waiting, so put your hands together and thank yourselves, and enjoy the rest of the evening.